Welcome everyone. Today we're talking Discipline Priest. Now that we have an official release date, it's time to take a hard look at what's changed with Discipline and how good it's going to be in Shadowlands. In this video, I'll be going over spells, talents, covenants, legendaries, and how Discipline feels in Mythic Plus. Before we jump into spells, you should probably take a look at your keyboard and ask yourself where you're going to find a bunch of new hotkeys, because we've got a lot of new spells. We picked up Mind Blast, Mind Soothe, and Mind Seer, as well as Shadow or Death and Power Infusion. First, let's take a look at the damage spells. Mind Blast is a big single target nuke with the added effect of having a damage absorb, similar to how Smite used to work. Mind Seer is essentially our new Holy Nova that does more damage and can be used at range. Keep in mind, much like Holy Nova, only the first hit of Mind Seer will heal via Atonement. Shadow or Death is a massive nuke that does even more damage if the target is below 20% health. Although this doesn't trigger Atonement, the Kiss of Death legendary effect reduces the cooldown on Shadow or Death and causes it to trigger Atonement. This legendary looks like a strong contender for 5-man content. Next, let's take a look at the new utility spells. Mind Soothe seems fairly cool and will probably have some uses in dungeons, but relative to other crowd control abilities, it's a bit on the weaker side. Power Infusion is a targetable 25% haste buff. I know some people aren't a fan of this being a targeted spell since it incentivizes using this on DPS players, but personally I like the flexibility here. Overall, I'm pretty happy with all the new spells. Min-maxing Shadow or Death sniping on low health targets without dying is a ton of fun. Being able to Mind Seer as a filler from range feels good, and knowing that I have Power Infusion as a healing cooldown smooths over some of the gaps in Mythic Plus, especially when HPS is so much more of a challenge early on. I also like how Shadow or Death and Mind Blast allows us to get some extra healing during our Schism windows. On the topic of spells, several spells have gotten some modifications. Shadow Fiend duration has been greatly reduced, but gives you mana back. Smite no longer puts a damage absorb on your target, but by far the most impactful change is Rapture now immediately applies an empowered shield when cast. This is a huge buff that gives Rapture more flexibility to be used as an emergency defensive, as well as making it just feel a lot better. Next up is talents. A lot of changes here as well. Power Word Solace's base cooldown has been increased from 10 to 15 seconds. Shadow Covenant has gotten a huge overhaul, which really looks interesting. When you cast it, it does a little bit of healing, but then empowers all of your shadow spells to do 25% more damage for the next 9 seconds. The catch? You can't cast holy spells for that 9 seconds. Now, I don't think we'll know for sure how good this is until after launch, but the idea is pretty cool, and there's definite potential here. One thing to mention, while testing this, I noticed that Covenant abilities that usually trigger Atonements, like Mind Games, don't seem to trigger Atonement when cast under the Shadow Covenant buff. I have no idea if this is intended or not, but I thought it was worth mentioning here. The last big talent change came from the level 50 row, where Lenience was recently brought back, and Spirit Shell was added. Spirit Shell looks like it might be a niche pick for any fights requiring a huge shield prior to a specific mechanic, but sacrificing Rapture and one of the other talents in that row, like Evangelism or Lenience, seems to be a very steep cost for this talent. Next up is Covenants. In Shadowlands, your character gets to pick one Covenant, which unlocks a generic Covenant ability and a class-specific Covenant ability. I'll be perfectly honest with you, nobody, including me, knows yet which of these abilities are going to be numerically optimal under all conditions, and most of these Covenants have been changing very frequently on the beta. So I'm going to go over what they are right now and give you the strategy I'm going to use to select mine. First up is the Kyrian Covenant. Their generic ability is Summon Steward, and the class ability is Boon of the Ascended. The Steward is actually very strong. Once every 5 minutes, you can get 3 potions that remove a harmful effect and heal you for 20% of your health. These potions recently got changed to not share cooldown with health stones and health pots. As far as utility is concerned, Steward ranks pretty high up there. Boon of the Ascended has been nerfed a bit, but seems to be one of the stronger picks, especially in Mythic Plus. While it's only the first hit that triggers Atonement now, it's still a lot of damage and healing. One drawback is you have to get into melee range to use this ability. Next, we have the Night Fae. Their generic ability is Soul Shape, which is essentially a blink and movement speed ability on a 90-second cooldown. As mobility is a weakness for us, this can look enticing, but I'm just not sure a 90-second cooldown makes it good enough to take. The class ability Fae Guardians allows you to use 3 different abilities for various offensive and defensive effects. I'm not sure how I feel about this one. Unless it's a clear winner numerically, it just seems a bit clunky to use compared to the other Covenants. The third Covenant is the Necrolords. Their generic ability is Fleshcraft, which gives you a 20% shield for 4 seconds of channeling. I played around with this a bunch, and it just feels bad having to channel this ability for 4 seconds every 2 minutes. I know one of the soul binds allows you to move while channeling, and maybe that helps, but overall it just felt clunky to use. Fleshcraft also gives you buffs if you channel near corpses, which could potentially be pretty powerful if min-maxed correctly. The class ability is Unholy Nova, which applies a dot to all targets within 15 yards for 15 seconds, with a duration that can be extended to 25 seconds with a specific soulbind. This was off the charts with Atonement until they nerfed it to only apply 1 dot's worth of Atonement healing every tick. Unfortunate. Finally, the last covenant is Venthyr. The generic ability is a teleport on a 1-minute cooldown. While this sounds really cool in theory, it does come with a 1.5 second cast time, so it's not super useful as an emergency movement spell like Night Phase Soul Shape. However, I can see this being useful for some skips or getting over impassable terrain. The class ability Mind Games seems a bit odd. The good news is, unlike Kyrian and Necrolords, Mind Games is a simple 1 global spell every 45 seconds that can be used from ranged and contributes to Atonement transfer. It's also worth noting, Mind Games gives you mana back if it reverses healing and damage. So now that we know what all the covenants do, I want to rank them according to a few categories. I'm assuming the numbers for these abilities are still being tuned, so I won't rank them in terms of numerically optimal player power. Instead, I want to take a look at simplicity and utility. My top 2 picks for simplicity are Venthyr and Kyrian. I can see myself getting good use out of the Venthyr Door of Shadows and Mind Games in any situation. Both are easy to use and I'd get high uptime out of them. Kyrian is also high on the simplicity scale. Summon your steward to get your potions, and Boon of the Ascended is relatively straightforward to use. Night Phase scores a bit lower on my simplicity list. The class ability Fey Guardians is overly complex, but Soul Shape is pretty straightforward. Finally, with the melee range requirement of Unholy Nova and the 4-second channel of Fleshcraft, Necrolords feel like the clunkiest to play, with heavy situational and positional requirements. Even if Unholy Nova gets tuned to be numerically optimal, I feel like I would have higher uptime with the other Covenant abilities due to range requirements. Next, let's look at utility. I think the clear winner here is Kyrian with the Steward. Having access to an extra health potion that can also cleanse you of certain effects seems incredibly strong. Next on the list would have to be the 2 movement abilities, Night Phase Soul Shape and Venthyr's Door of Shadows. Once again, I have to put Necrolords at the bottom. Fleshcraft just can't compete with the other Covenant's utility. Right now I'm leaning toward Kyrian or Venthyr, but again, these abilities are still being tuned, so I'm just 1 patch notes away from changing my mind. Next up, let's talk Legendaries. Vault of Heavens, Twins of the Sun Priestess, Measured Contemplation, Crystalline Reflection, and the Penitent one don't seem very strong to me. I may be wrong, or they could get tuned to be stronger, but I think the ones worth initially getting are going to be Clarity of Mind or Kiss of Death for Raid, and Kiss of Death or Cauterizing Shadows for Mythic Plus. One good thing about Shadowlands relative to Legion is you'll be able to target your Legendaries instead of being subject to RNG, so everyone should have their best Legendary before stepping into Raid Week 1. Now that we've talked spells, talents, covenants, and Legendaries, how does the Discipline Priest feel in keys? It's always hard to judge a spec at the beginning of a new expansion, since the stat squish dramatically affects how the spec is played. I went from 50% to 5% haste going from live to beta, so it's hard to tell what exact heals per second will be in keys, but we can talk about how the playstyle has changed. First of all, I have to say Rapture feels way better. Instantly applying a shield when you cast Rapture adds a massive amount of defensive value to this spell. Second, Power Infusion really adds a lot to the kit to fill in the gaps where everything else is on cooldown. I find myself using Rapture fairly liberally and leaning heavily on Power Infusion to top people off after heavy mechanics. Being off the GCD is also a huge plus. Third, Mindseer is theoretically really good, but I found most of my initial globals are spent applying Purge the Wicked, and although Mindseer does more damage on 3 targets or more than Smite, Smite still does more atonement healing, which at this point I usually need. I can see Mindseer being used more as a DPS filler later on in the tier when the healing checks are a little easier to meet due to gear. And finally, Shadow or Death is just awesome. Min-maxing the sniping is both fun and rewarding as it does huge damage and atonement transfer if you're using the Kiss of Death legendary. I may have put myself in a few bad spots when low on health, but the way I look at it is almost killing yourself as you execute a mob is half the fun of using this spell. So there you have it. Discipline is shaping up to be a very fun and flexible spec in Shadowlands. My hunch is it will be one of the strongest, if not the strongest healer in Raid, and one of the upper middle tier Mythic Plus specs. We still have a few months left, and Blizzard seems to be releasing balance updates weekly at this point, so anything's possible. But what do you guys think? Are you thinking about playing Priest in Shadowlands? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this video and want to see more like it, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.